Hello and welcome to another episode of Purple Tories. My name is Damien Heads, aka the Young PJW. First of all, can I apologise for my hair at the moment because I haven't been able to have a haircut since lockdown's begun, and my hair was already long before lockdown started, so that wasn't good news. But today on my show, I have as my guest Jake Scott, who is editor of The Mallard, which is would you say it's a conservative online media publication?
Oh, yes. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. Yes, it's hard to define it in a way. It's not an organization. It just kind of operates as an online publication for originally young people, but now just conservatives who hopefully have never had a chance to actually share their work before and see it as an opportunity to do so, hopefully.
Right. Okay. And what's the particular focus of the publication?
So this is actually something that people have asked me more and more recently. Obviously, there's the emergence of certain groups on different sides, and on the sort of neoliberal wing, you've got 1828. On the more traditionalist wing, you've got people like Bournebrook and Burkean. Bournebrook I was associated with for a while, and the Burkean I know quite well. And people often wonder where we fit in with this, and the answer is that in a way we don't, mostly because we don't actually have a particular stance. It benefits in a way from being just myself, in the sense that I just want to give people a voice. So I'm not really concerned as to whether you're a liberal Tory or a conservative with a small c, or even if you're not really a Tory and actually you're just interested in politics and you want to write and get your voice out. That's kind of my goal. So it's not really that we have a particular stance on anything. It's more that we try and maintain principles of free speech. And all I ask is that if you can write well and are well, then I will happily put your article online.
Yeah. I tend to find in the sort of groups I am a part of, it tends to be a real mix of socially conservatives and classical liberals and libertarians. And so I feel like we all sort of have a kind of bond in some strange way. I don't know why.
I think to be honest with you, there's this over obsession on the right at the moment with different forms of rightism. It's ironic in a way, because about 2 or 3 years ago I was saying this is what's going to be coming, and I wish I wasn't right. But as much as I say that, there is a need for it. I think the Conservative Party has in a way lost its way, and more than anything this time needs intellectual direction, and I struggle to see where that will come from, to be honest with you. So as long as the fruit of this discussion is positive, then it's productive. But at the moment, it just seems to be bickering and obsessed with claims as to who's the real conservatives and all this sort of thing. And I think we need to remember that the real enemy is on the left, and that's the real existential problem. And we need to stop really this infighting, in my opinion, at least for the moment.
Yeah, well, I find the little bits of infighting to be quite niche anyway, to be honest. I don't find there's major fighting if you speak to people who are more right-leaning in general. It just tends to be, when you get more to the fringes of, people, for instance, who are like extreme libertarians or extremely socially conservative. I don't think these people are the main breadth of conservative-minded people.
No, I agree. I want to kind of put an asterisk on what I just said, in a way, in that there is something that needs to be said. You can't just call yourself a conservative. That's not going to work. If you genuinely believe certain unconservative principles and believe them for unconservative reasons, then you're not a conservative, and that's where the line needs to be drawn, in my opinion. So it shouldn't be over the nuances of, you know, whether you believe in the free market or you know, homosexual marriage or racial equality, or these sorts of things. It's more existential. It's more social. It's more over how you see the relationship between the individual, between society and the state. That to me is the real battleground. And I think the longer we mire ourselves in these minutiae details of, well, I really like the idea of a land value tax. Oh, well, I quite like the idea of, you know, scrapping inheritance tax. That's great. That's all very well and good, but you're still talking in this paradigm. You're not really breaking out of it. And I think the real problem is that our current paradigm is defined by the left. It's funny in a way, you know. Mr. Corbyn said after the 2019 general election that he won the argument and all this, and I, you know, he's wrong, frankly, because he didn't do anything productive. He didn't help win an argument. The argument was won by the left decades ago, and sadly that's the paradigm we're working in. And that's what we need to work on is moving outside of this paradigm, this kind of neoliberal paradigm that, and I don't mean neoliberal in the sense of, you know, necessarily policies. I mean in the sense of thinking, this style of thinking about the relationship between the individual and the state. It's and the fact that that's how the conversation is phrased. It's not a discussion about the individual and society, because as we all know, there's no such thing as society, or that's the famous proclamation. But of course, that's only half the story, and that's literally only half the quote. So I think at the moment we need to just shift past this obsession with the small parts and work out what we actually mean by conservative. And I think that's the only way we're going to move forward. But that battleground needs to be shifted away from, as I say, the minutiae and more to the grand scheme, and breaking out of a paradigm that's been dominated by left-wing thinking for the last 30 years.
Well, let me tell you something interesting, actually, because this is something I just learned today. I have a friend called John Wong. He does a lot of work with Sargon of Akkad, and he actually set up the petition for the government to release the report on grooming gangs. And it's just got over 125,000 signatures now. And he got a reply, I think, yesterday from the petition company, who and it actually said at the bottom of the letter, "My pronouns are her and she." So even like at Downing Street at this level, you have them doing this pronoun stuff. You know, it's unbelievable.
Well, rather.
Yeah.
I find that whole discussion to be absurd, to be honest with you. That on the one hand, so my perspective on this, broadly speaking, is that denying that transgender people exist is idiocy. They obviously do, but the phrase transgender has to be understood in the schema of a framework, and that framework is gender. So when people say things like gender doesn't exist, well, that's lunacy. And when people say things like I can be multiple genders, or I can be, you know, this, that, or the other, well, just ignoring the possibility of a framework altogether, which in itself eats itself. You can't deny a framework that is this framework that the vast majority of people live in. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that pronouns have grown up as part of a lexical evolution based on obvious signs. You know, my favorite YouTuber is Blair White, and she does a fantastic breakdown of all this stuff. And I remember one time she was having a particular problem with Riley Dennis, who calls herself trans, but makes no effort to appear feminine apart from long hair. I mean, you've got long hair for a man. You wouldn't call you a woman. And I wouldn't call someone who looks like myself a woman, even though I've seen women with short hair, and God knows we've now seen women with beards, because I don't physically look like a woman, or at least I don't hope I don't. And these, you know, a name is 90% of the time not an ambiguous thing. You know, even the things like Jamie or Chris, you know, these kind of like gender neutral names, they're shortened versions of masculine or feminine names. So when someone puts their pronouns, it's 99% of the time irrelevant. So why do it?
Yeah.
And for those people who are asked, which one are you, then they ought to, say which ones they are. And I've got no problem if someone says to me, well, I'm a he or a she. I'm more than happy to call them by what they are. It's politeness in my opinion. But I struggle with they, largely because the English language has not really developed a singular they. And it's not developing it now. It's having it forced on it, which is not evolution. It's logical dictates. So that's my general stance on the issue, really. And having it at the bottom of a letter is superfluous, because a letter ought not to be about, especially an official letter, ought not to be about the people sending it. It ought to be about the content, and that's a really virtue signaling thing to do, in my opinion. If you're writing a letter and it's meant to be official, and at the bottom of it you're talking about, or you're just putting in your pronouns, then you're making it about you, and it's not supposed to be about you. It's supposed to be about content.
Yeah, the scary thing is, which Jordan Peterson describes well, is not that these crazy leftists are saying we should adopt this stuff. It's that the adults in the room, the people who are like in these official positions, are actually taking it on and doing it in their letters and in their teaching or whatever. It's like the adults have left the room. That's how it feels.
Yeah, so I had to take a course. So I'm a doctoral researcher at the University of Birmingham, and I teach, and I had to take this inclusivity and equality and diversity training. And parts of it were useful, and I'm worried that I'm going to get in trouble here from what I'm saying here. But the person who began the course started with, I'm X, and my pronouns are she, her. And I sat there and I thought, I know, I can tell. and again, the vast majority of people who call themselves make an effort to appear that way. So, it's the, at the end of the day, people are reasonable. I like to think people are reasonable. And if someone says, he or she incorrectly, I'd like to think that the person who has been called that incorrectly is reasonable enough to say, well, no, actually, I'm X. I'm the other. And I'd like to think the person who's been told that reasonably is prepared to go, okay, sorry, I'll call you that. It shouldn't have to be this whole elaborate thing of and you're right. It felt like the adults had left the room. It felt like we were all there, kind of having a little bit of a giggle at this whole thing. And I was just sat there thinking, what are we seriously going to let abstract ideological thinking dictate the way we talk to one another? And I think we just lost sight of things. And like you say, there's no one in the room who's prepared to say, but that makes no sense. Or as I say, I can tell. This is the strange thing. Of course, you can tell when someone's a he or a she 99% of the time.
So, what do you think that is? Is that, could you perhaps link it, as I know a lot of people do, to the decline in things like Christianity and traditional values? Or is this something more esoteric?
It's a good question. I'm not. Okay, so yes, I'm a Christian myself, and I'm not really a fan of trying to politicize the religion. And I'm not saying that's necessarily what you're doing. I'm frustrated more with people who say things like Jesus was, pro sex work because he knew Mary Magdalene, which of course ignores the whole point of his relationship with Mary Magdalene. What frustrates me is the way we essentially allow people to write their own rules when it comes to these things. And there's a fantastic book called Politics on the Edges of Liberalism by Benjamin Arditi. Now, Arditi, I think, I'm not too sure, I think he's kind of in the post-Marxist tradition. And I like post-Marxism in terms of reading it because it's fun, but also it's helpful to know what the other side thinks. And he talks about, in quite disparaging ways, actually, talks about the growth of identity politics. And during this chapter, he talks about a really elaborate way of how the post-democratic revolution essentially introduced the idea of undecidability. Now, undecidability essentially means that there is no common ground between individuals, and essentially that common ground has to be found and refound continuously. Excuse me, which is part of the logic of democratic elections. It has to be a constant renegotiation of sites of contest. This is another famous post-Marxist thought process. What that means is that rather than finding a relationship of identity in the outside, you find a relationship of identity to the internal. And what this does, because it connects to liberalism, is it essentializes not the individual in relation to the world, but the individual in relation to themselves. So it creates a sphere of what he calls sovereignization, where the person, the individual, is capable of deciding how they live. Now, this, in a way, is liberal, but it's liberal to an extent, and it goes beyond the boundaries of liberalism. Liberalism, Roger Scruton was quite true and correct about this, and he said that liberalism creates this sphere of freedom around the individual that can be claimed against the state, and that's true. You know, that's true with regards to life, thought, speech to an extent. And this is something else interesting. When you claim these rights, you claim them against something, and it has to be against the state, because the state's the only formal institution capable of sort of responding in kind. The issue that Arditi points out is that we've gone beyond this now. So it's no longer a case of rights. It's no longer a case of, you know, essential abstract things that, even though are claimed to the individual, are claimed by all, to things that are claimed by the individual only by the individual. So it's essentially a way of privileging uniqueness. You know, this thing we grow up with. Everyone's grown up with it these days. Of we're all special and we're all unique. It essentially privileges that style of thinking into a political relationship, and that damages our capacity for communal action, because it means we can claim our freedom against other people. And that puts an onus on other people to act. It doesn't require people to step back from you. It requires people to step to you and to engage with you how you determine it to be, not how is a reasonable way of approaching it. So that's a rather long-winded way of kind of answering that short question. I'm sorry if I've gone off there.
So you saying that in the past we had our own idea of where our rights extend, but we had more of a boundary to where those could go, and that boundary has somehow sort of disappeared in our minds. Is that essentially a more dumb way of saying what you said?
I don't know if it's a more dumb way. I think it's a plainer way of saying it, because you know, I am an academic and I'm lost in the academic lexical forest. But yeah, like so essentially, when you have a right and you claim that right, because a right is a claim, you have to claim it against something, and that thing you claim it against has to have a capacity for responding. Now, if you claim it against the state as an institution has a way of feeding that claim through to itself. Society does not, because society is not a cohesive whole. But the relationship that rights as an individual holder have to society is not that society gives you these rights, but rather society is your method of finding them. Now, you don't know, for instance, that you have a right to free speech in relationship to the state. I mean, you do, but it's more about how you discover these things. And you don't discover them against some faceless state. You discover them in relationship to other people, like you and I now, or people in the street. And that's the same with rights and property and life and so on and so forth. It's society is the method of discovering them. If the state is involved, the state is the method of securing them. That's the relationship that conservatives broadly kind of see between rights in the individual and society. The problem is that because those rights were found through society, society also had what we would call a constitutive role on those rights. So society was a way of us discovering what rights could be claimed by the individual, what rights could be claimed by the state, what rights could be claimed by the community, and so on and so forth. The problem is that that has shifted so that it's no longer a method of finding rights through society. It's now a method of claiming those rights against society. You are the only person who is capable of saying what you are. And that essentially erodes the relationship between the individual and society. And if the relationship between the individual and society breaks down, then you no longer have the capacity for feeding that right claim into the state, because the state responds to these right claims discovered by society. So if the individual becomes the center or the origin of rights, abstracted from society, then the state will only ever deal with that individual as they on that individual's terms. And that's a good thing in some respects, but it's bad in others. It means that it has to deal with every single citizen in its own way. And that breaks things down, because it can no longer universalize, or, you know, to the extent that the state exists, it can no longer universalize codes of behavior. It has to treat people entirely individually, and that completely erodes the capacity for communal action.
So because the rights we've originally had have come from the state, that's kind of meant that these rights are kind of up for grabs, so to speak. And so that we can, as we are now doing, have demanded more rights now, because in a sense, they're kind of arbitrary anyway. And so that's probably where you get things like hate speech laws and things like that, I would guess, because it's certain groups demanding more rights. Is there an argument that perhaps in America, you know, obviously they've got the Constitution, and the Constitution can actually be changed, but for the most part, it is a solid document which doesn't change. And I feel like perhaps maybe their rights are more permanently enshrined. But that's going off subject a bit. Another thing I wanted to mention actually is maybe in the past, these rights which were given by the state were more rooted perhaps in Christian ideology, as opposed to them just being arbitrary. And maybe that gave them more of a strong foundation, perhaps. Whilst now, because we don't have Christianity is so much in the forefront of society, perhaps now that we don't have that foundation, our rights have just become endless, because it's not based in anything. It's just based in our own minds. What would you say to those 2 points?
So I think, as a point of clarification, it's not necessarily that the rights come from the state. It's more that the security of rights comes from the state.
The security,
yeah. The rights themselves are discovered by the individual in society through essentially, well, I mean, this is actually an interesting conversation. So the concept of a right to life is discovered through an experience that stretches all the way back to the foundation of any community. Now, every single community has its own founding myths. You know, there's in Greek, there's autochthony. In Rome, there's the whole idea of Remus and Romulus. In Christianity, obviously, it goes all the way back to Adam and Eve. But the idea of, say, necessarily the right to life in the Christian doctrine, and this is what I understand, so I'm apologies if it's wrong, largely comes from the violation of the covenant in Cain and Abel. Now, when you know, when is it Cain that kills Abel? I can never remember which way around it is.
I can't remember either.
Whoever kills who, it's a violation. It's felt to be a violation, and it's reinforced through Christian doctrine all the way. So when you have the scientific revolution that essentially takes away the Christian reason for it, it's not necessarily that the right is, you know, deduced from just complete abstract thinking. It's rather that the history of Christendom in the West influences our very capacity of thinking about rights. So when people claim that the right to life is an essential right, personally, I think that's because of the history of Christianity in the West. You can't do without it, and that was always going to be the case. So my answer in terms of the decline of Christianity and its relationship to, I think the lack of an authority is certainly visible. But again, part of what Aditi talks about is this kind of erosion of authority, and it's something conservatives are very concerned about in the entirety of the 20th century: the decline of deference and the death of authority, and all these things. With regards to rights inflation, so again, Roger Scruton talks about this a lot. You claim your right by virtue of being human, and that's that's all very well and good, human rights and all the rest. But if you can claim any right as a human right, who is there to tell you that you can't? Now that's that's kind of a dangerous ground to tread on, because on the one hand, you've got acceptable rights and rights that are recognizable as universal, and that's what the basis of rights ought to be. The problem is that there are then particular rights that are claimed by unique societies that emerge only out of cultural circumstances, that are then claimed to be human. Take the instance of, for instance, the human right to abortion. The idea of a human right to abortion is absurd, because it can only ever be women that have an abortion. It can't be all of humanity. So it's not a universalizable right. It can be a privilege, and it can by all means be a privilege that has grown up in a cultural institution. But you have to recognize that it's a culturally rooted privilege. It's not a right. So I agree in the sense that there's a decline of authority, especially with regards to Christianity, that has led to a certain rights inflation. That isn't inherently a problem, provided there's an authority that can replace God. And that's essentially what Nietzsche was talking about at the end of the 19th century. God is dead. We need something to replace him. And I'm not going to go into Nietzschean philosophy here, but essentially we didn't.
I love Nietzschean philosophy.
Well, I think a lot of people do, because he's a very interesting thinker. But the issue is that we didn't really replace God. There was no kind of universal authority. And as a result, it became a very particularized authority. And that authority tended to be the state. So rather than, this universal authority, it became an authority in a particular area. So it was a fusion of the secular and temporal, which had existed as separately for 2 millennia. So now you can only ever claim things through the state. You can't claim them through an authority external to the state. And if the only way you can claim things is through the state, then the state becomes the ultimate arbiter in any possible discussion around these things. And if the state is the only possible arbiter, then the state is the only one that can tell the state if it's right or wrong. And of course, the state is always going to say that the state is right. So you end up in this circumstance where, through our very desire to push the state away, we actually end up bringing it closer. And if you can't live in a way without an authority in your life that is, there to control you, apart from yourself, then you're not really living. You're just kind of doing what you're told. And this is ironic, the slave mentality that Nietzsche was so terrified of.
That's really interesting. Yeah. Not to bang on too much about Christianity in particular, but I did find it quite interesting. I did a poll in Purple Tories, and it was basically, what do you see as the main way of getting society back in check, essentially, from all this nonsense which is going on at the moment? And I didn't even put this on the list, I don't think, and almost everyone put a return to Christianity, a return to Christian and traditional values. And this is a group which isn't, full of Christians particularly, and most of these people are probably atheists, as far as I know. But it does seem like, even more hilariously, actually, I was at a event that Sargon of Akkad did. I can't remember where it was, where he had various people asking him questions, and one person said to him, "Look, I'm not a Christian. I never have been, but I feel like I should become a Christian just to be able to oppose this nonsense more strongly, because it seems like I need this to be able to oppose it in a more authoritative way."
That's I mean, it's encouraging in a way to see people prepared to stand up for the history of this country, and and for the West in general. It's ironic. So the histories that I tended to read, especially a fantastic book called Inventing the Individual by Larry Siedentop, talked about how the invention of secular sphere was only a possibility with Christianity. Now, I'm not one to make denigrating comments against individual religions, because there are certainly important parts of pretty much all faiths, and there are dangerous parts of every faith as well. But if you take, for instance, Christianity and compare it to Islam, Islam sees the relationship between the individual and the religion as fundamental. It overrides everything. In Christianity, the relationship between the individual and the religion is itself a particular sphere, and the individual between the relationship between the individual and the secular world, the temporal world, is another sphere. And this was a big thing in the 1400s. I think it might have been the 1300s. Pope Boniface the Sixth and Philip the Fair of France had what was called the investiture crisis, where essentially there was this whole problem of who is the authority. Is it the Pope in Rome, or is it the king in Paris? And it mostly played out through the relationship of the clergy to either of these things. For instance, the question was, if a member of the clergy breaks the law, who punishes him? Is it the Pope, or is it the king? And the answer, I don't particularly know the individual answers to these cases, but it has tended in the direction of the state. And the birth of the idea of a regional monarchy, which then became a territorialized state, which moved in the direction of nationhood, in itself is only possible in a world, or in a Western world, where Christianity is the dominant religion, because it makes the capacity for the state to emerge. In the other areas of the world, they've emerged in a particular direction. And I don't know enough about them to make really detailed comparisons. But Islam is a particular challenge for the West, because it sees this distinction between temporal authority and spiritual authority as ridiculous. And a lot of people sympathize with that. They think, well, yeah, you're right. Like, if God is real, God overrides everything. So essentially, the idea of returning to Christendom in a way is almost just a reassertion of the liberal tradition. And I don't necessarily mean the liberal tradition as we understand it in the 21st century, but in the idea that you relate to something as an individual. You don't relate as a member of a collective first and foremost, but you relate to everything as an individual. And that, has declined in many ways. It's declined in some respects, but as I talked about earlier, it's been elevated in many. So it's hard to know which one is actually more legitimate. And as a result, the West is kind of losing its character, its identity, in my opinion. So the challenge for the West comes from a growing religion that does not distinguish between the state and faith, and another sort of internal challenge that just rejects the idea of God altogether. And it's only with a belief in the empowering of the individual through things like charity and faith and love that is in the Christian tradition, can we really maintain what we built. And that's the other thing. We built this civilization over generations, innumerable generations, and it's a very frail thing. It's a hard-won victory, and it's recently won. It's not a victory that's been won for centuries. It probably is even as recent as decades, but it is a victory, and we need to accept that. And to deny ourselves our own victory is to admit defeat at the outset, in my opinion.
I'm going to ask this next question mostly for myself, actually, because I do find it interesting. Are you a Protestant or a Catholic?
I'm an Anglo-Catholic.
An Anglo-Catholic, okay.
Yeah.
I was
so
expecting...
a lot of people would take that differently. Church of England.
What's the difference? Yeah, what's the difference between a Catholic and an Anglo-Catholic?
So I mean, I'm still relatively new to the religion in many ways. Like I reconverted when I was 19, which, oh Christ, that was 5 years ago, so it really wasn't all that recent. The main thing is that we reject the authority of the Pope. It's the head of the church is the monarch. And the other thing is over transubstantiation. I can't really tell you the details because I don't know that much authoritatively.
Is this a real denomination in the UK? People who say they're Catholic but rejects the Pope?
Well, that's the Church of England. In
The
many
Church
ways.
of England.
Yeah, the Church of England, Anglicanism.
You're calling yourself an Anglo-Catholic.
Yeah. So this, I mean, the thing, right? Like, Church of England is a Protestant movement in the sense that it literally is born out of protest, but it's Catholic in that it finds its lineage all the way back to St. Paul. So it's, it linguistically and semantically, it's Protestant and Catholic. I think it defines itself as Reformed Catholic. Essentially, that's essentially what it calls itself in Mass.
But just to make clear, according to old definitions or traditional definitions, you are an Anglican.
Yes, yeah, I'm an Anglican.
Yeah.
That's what I call myself. But right. Anglo-Catholic is what I've been told to call myself recently. So that's what I go with.
Because it's a subject which I've sort of delved into a little bit. How our country essentially split from the church in the Reformation. And I think it was actually probably a good thing back then, because I don't think our culture would have developed in the same way if we didn't split from the Roman Catholic Church, because I think there was more reason to split from the Roman Catholic Church back then, because I think it wasn't the great moral authority it perhaps could have been at the time. But I actually think the way to bring society back to Christendom is actually to return to the Catholic Church, because of the emphasis on the Latin Mass and the tradition, and there's more ritual to it. And I actually think that I think Anglicanism in particular is too weak. And I think that's demonstrated if you look at the current crop of priests and senior figures in the Anglican Church. And I don't think it has affected the Catholic Church quite as much. What would you say to that?
I agree. I have a friend who took me along to the church that I'm now a part of, St. Augustine's in Edgbaston. And before we went, I think I said to him, is this going to be, guitars and all that sort of thing? And he said, oh no, this is proper church. And I was quite happy to hear that. Similarly, ironically enough, so on the street that I live in Birmingham, the street over, pretty much, as the crow flies from my window, a church, and I was over the moon to hear this. 5-minute walk, if that, to mass on Sunday. But someone I know who, when I moved into the street, said, it's very progressive, and she said that as a positive, and I just went, well, no, thank you, I'm not interested in that. And I remember reading this article a couple of years ago about how this sort of movement back to the church is really interesting in the bells and the fashion masses and all these things. And it's nice, for one thing, it's really nice, but for another thing, it gives you meaning. You can actually feel the history behind it. I think, Peter Hitchens talked about this in The Abolition of Britain, when he talked about the difference between the Book of Common Prayer and what I believe is, I don't even know the names, the Common Prayer Book or something like that. It's a bastardization, basically, of the Common Book of Prayer, as Book of Common Prayer. And in the Book of Common Prayer, the language is genuinely transcendental, because it forces you to actually focus on what you're saying, which brings you out of the temporal moment and into the transcendental experience. You don't get that with the modern church. When I went to university, like my first year, I tried to join the Christian Union, and I went along to one of the services. The first service I went to was in a school sports hall. I was sat on a, what Americans call bleachers. I don't know what we would call them. And a band was playing, and I remember sitting here thinking, what is this? Am I in High School Musical, or am I in a church? I can't figure it out. So I personally felt so uncomfortable with this idea that we have to be, hip and young in order to appeal to young people. I also hate the idea that you have to appeal to people to be relevant. Things are relevant or they're not. It's not determined by young people, in my opinion. I keep saying that, in my opinion. But I suppose maybe I should be a bit more forthright in saying I truly, genuinely believe that. I completely agree. I don't understand this desire to make the church fun. It's not supposed to be. It's not meant to be a fun experience. And I think a lot of people find that daunting. This idea that you actually have to atone for your sins, recognize that you are not a perfect being, is very difficult for modern people, but it's essential. It really is. And the Catholic Church is the best way of finding that. So I do agree. And I think maybe the Church of England, lost, frankly. It's deep. It's all the way up to the Archbishop, and it's just embarrassing days having a helter-skelter in a cathedral. What?
Yeah.
Sorry, I got a little bit upset.
What's stopping you from converting to Catholicism then?
I was raised. Well, I wasn't raised church. I went to a Church of England primary school, and I think it's natural for me. It feels more like home. That's all I can say, really.
Okay, that's fair enough. Also, you study politics in populism. That's what your PhD is in, right?
Yeah, so I'm a political theorist, and populism is my field.
Yeah, so I can link the two discussions here quite nicely. Are you familiar with Nick Fuentes?
I am, yeah. America First. Yeah,
I know he's like a very sort of fringe figure, and he's controversial. But it's quite interesting that on the sort of the more alt-right side of politics, they're really going with the Christian roots in their politics. I don't know how to put it. And people like Nick Fuentes really sort of say, "Oh, we should be returning to Catholicism and things like that." Why do you think people like that are on that bandwagon? I know it's an interesting question, but
well, enough. I'm writing a paper related to this at the moment. So there was a book that came out in February, literally just called Populism, and it as an introductory text by a man called Benjamin Moffat. And Moffat's a fantastic theorist, and the book is very good, if I may say so. It's fantastic. It's a really good introduction. But there are issues that I have with it, and one of those issues is with especially the chapter on populism's anti-liberal nature. Now, when he talks about populists and being anti-liberal, he cites instances of people like Nick Fuentes. He doesn't necessarily cite Fuentes, but he cites Pim Fortuyn and Geert de Wilders, the Netherlands, and he also, Ban and the Lega Nord in Italy. And he said, and this is something that I disagree with, he says that these people, these populists, claim to defend Christendom as a way of legitimizing their prejudices. And he said that these people lip service to liberalism. And I find that to be quite, for one thing, to be quite patronizing. It presumes that these people don't truly believe the same. And if you're prepared to say that, then you can say that about anyone. And the other thing is that you have to remember, people like, Pim Fortuyn was a sexual man, and he was quite vocal about the threat to homosexual rights posed by the immigrant population in the Netherlands. which was primarily Muslim, but was also very fundamentalist Christian from places like Africa. And this is a really interesting question, because I think Moffat would answer your question by saying it's a way of legitimizing hatred. But I'm sympathetic to the argument. I'm also sympathetic to the actual legitimacy behind their claims. So I think they see, in the same way that I do, in a way, that the birth of modern or classical liberalism is Christian, and it's, I mean, in many ways, a combination of Catholicism and Protestantism. It's kind of that combination of Protestant ethic and Catholic authoritarianism, which is not necessarily an inherently bad thing. I mean, authority is quite a good thing, in my opinion. So I think the way they defend Christendom in the face is because there's a void of meaning in the West. Also, they truly, genuinely see the origins of their belief system in Christianity. I think it's extremely patronizing to say that they're wrong. I'm entirely on Fuentes' side. I don't necessarily appreciate nationalism, but I definitely appreciate where he's coming from with regards to Christianity and the birth of the liberal West.
Yeah, and I actually think I kind of agree with you there. I think, the whole sensation of the Groypers and things like that. These people, if they were to go to, a more Christian way of life, I actually think that's better for them than if they were to not be Christian. And, in their heads, a lot of them probably think that they're losing their civilization. And so I think if they weren't Christian, they would probably be more likely to do something stupid, like, shoot up a mosque or something really quite terrible. Do you know what I mean?
I see where you're coming from. I mean, I'm not entirely sure how far that works for everyone. A lot of people turn to Christianity as a way of, like you said, finding meaning. The danger is in the particular sect, and it's the same with religions. It's, the Westboro Baptists, for instance, in America. I have no real time, because they're not peaceful, and I'm not one to say they're not real Christians, but I doubt sincerity. And with jihad and extremists on the Islamic side of things, because I'm not one to parrot Islam as a religion. I don't necessarily think any religion of peace inherently, but when people find an existential moment of night, they are faced with this lack of meaning. A lot of people turn to something that gives them meaning, and for a lot of young immigrant men, especially in the West, that answer is Islam. And particular sect that they engage with. That's why you see so many in prisons, because when they're in prison, they find that they have this existential moment, and the answer is there, and it's normally a violent sect. And the same is in America. There are violent Christians in America. There are violent Christians in the world over. So I'm not trying to necessarily say that one is more violent than the other. But what I am trying to say is that seeking meaning in religion is great, provided you are taking it seriously. And I think that's essentially what you're saying, and I agree. But if you're going to convert to a religion, then you convert to it sincerely, and you listen to the faith, and you listen to the authority figures in the faith. Don't take it as an excuse to hate people. That is what some people genuinely do. I don't necessarily think that's the case, as I say, with people like Fuentes or Orban or Fortune Wilders. But I think that there are people who take religion as an opportunity to express their hatred, and that's a dangerous.
Yeah. I said in the title of this video we'd talk about coronavirus, but we haven't discussed it at all once.
Sorry, that's my fault. I've just gone off on.
Oh no, that's my fault also. I actually really enjoy talking about these kind of things. So what have you made of the lockdown? We recently had an announcement on Sunday from Boris Johnson. From what I can tell, nothing has really changed that much, other than they've got this new alert system which they've brought in, and instead of saying stay at home, they're saying stay alert. You know, what has actually really changed too much other than that?
Okay, so I was thinking before I came on how I was going to approach this. I think the first thing that I should probably point out is that obviously I don't know the science. I'm really really not knowledgeable about the science at all. I know that's not what you're asking me, so I just want to make that clear.
Yeah.
But I also make it clear that I'm not going to claim any kind of authority on that. What I think with regards to this is that your perspective on this depends on who you think is in charge. And by that, I think it means whether you think the people are leading or the government is leading. If you think the government is leading, then I think you're probably going to take a negative opinion on this. I think you're going to think that Johnson and the Conservative Party are being a bit reckless, maybe saying that it's that poor people can risk their lives and all these things. If you think that the people are leading, I think you're more inclined to sympathy with Johnson, because I think you're of the opinion that people are doing this anyway. Excuse me. And all the government's trying to do is stay on top of the situation. Now, in terms of where I fall in either camp, I think I fall in the latter. People are, by and large, flouting the rules. There are businesses that are open that probably shouldn't be. There are people going out who probably shouldn't be. And there are people who are meeting who probably shouldn't be. And I know that I've definitely broken these rules at times. But obviously, people are going to. And that's kind of a reality of life. So if you take the opinion that the Conservative Party and the government in general are trying to not necessarily control the situation, but kind of if it's almost like a relationship between, say, a sheepdog and a sheep. It knows where it wants the sheep to go, and all it can do is kind of herd them in that direction. It can't tell them that the relationship is not one of communication in that respect. But if they're going to move in a direction, then you want them to move in the direction you want them to move in. So that's kind of my opinion on that. I don't know if that necessarily answered the question. I feel like I tend to answer my own questions as opposed to
Well, it's interesting you point out that, well, you didn't exactly say it in these words, but the lockdown is actually hugely popular in this country. A lot of people are very supportive of it. But like you said, there are people who are starting not so much to protest it, but ignore it. And I've certainly noticed in more recent times, definitely a lot more cars on the road. So yes, I'm not sure what Boris Johnson's tactic is here, whether he's doing this because he really believes from a scientific perspective that this is going to stop it more than anything, or because it's so popular from the public, or if it's a mixture of both. It's hard to tell at this point. What do you reckon?
Yeah. Well, there was an article in The Spectator a week ago from, I think it was Rod Liddell, who basically said the decisions made on this are going to be political. They're not going to be scientific. His argument was largely that we don't have the science to make fully informed decisions, which I can sympathize with. We don't know everything about this virus. In fact, we honestly don't know what we don't know. In terms of, what is Johnson actually doing? What does he want to do here? I think he wants to remain popular. I think he like you say, he wants to be seen to be in touch with the public mood. And I think he has been. I think that's something that he really needs to be commended for. As you rightly point out, he has been, supported by and large by the British people in this period. It has declined. When it first kicked off, after maybe the first 3-week review, it was 95% from what I remember. Now it's about 70%. So it'd be interesting to see how those figures stack up now. The other thing is that I think it was 8 out of 10 people prioritize health over the economy. Now, I'm not an economist, so I don't know how far the NHS is going to require the economy that's going to come out of this. But it's really interesting that people are changing their attitudes. I think had this happened maybe 15 years ago, people would probably have been a lot more willing to go to work and accept this sort of thing. Now people seem to be more prepared to sacrifice the economy in favor of more, tangible things. And that's really interesting in itself. It runs counter to Johnson. This is the reason I mention this. Johnson's ideology seems to be one of, broadly speaking, liberalism. We might say libertarianism. We might just say, classical liberalism. So I think what Johnson's trying to do is stay in touch with the public mood, but also shift it in the direction that he wants it to shift. So when, for instance, he said on Sunday, we're encouraging you to go to work if you can, I think that was his instincts coming out, and he was trying his hardest to make sure that those instincts were not, counter to the public mood. Again, does that answer the question? I'm concerned I've not answered it.
I think so. So you're basically, do you think he's being sincere in the reasons why he's doing it, or do you think it is more politics, like you say? Do you think?
I think it's probably more politics.
More
I think
politics.
if he was being more sincere, I think he'd have been a lot more lenient in what was announced on Sunday than what actually was announced. But I do think it's more of a political move than a sincere one. And I think maybe that's not necessarily a bad thing, because putting the country at the mercy of your own whims is probably not the best thing.
It is quite funny because I actually do think coronavirus has been way overblown, and I think the measures are extremely draconian. However, I watched the press conference or the speech that Boris Johnson did, and the way he spoke about this new alert system and everything, I felt quite assured, and I felt like, oh great, we have this guy in control, even though I totally oppose what he's doing. So he does have that effect on you, I think, Boris, where I think he's really captured the nation, not just because of Corona, but in general. And I saw that coming way back, to be honest, because I used to watch him when he was London Mayor do his interviews in LBC. And so the coronavirus thing is not even that interesting to me anymore, to be honest, even though it's a terrible thing because lots of people are really suffering right now. I've managed to be quite lucky in that I had to leave I had to not work anymore because I'm an electrician and I work primarily in shops, and so that was just kaput. But I managed to get a night shift at Amazon. And so I'm still earning money, unlike some people. But also, I read today, actually, did you know that the furlong scheme is going to be extended by 4 months now?
Yes, I saw that. That is costing the government about. Sorry, it's costing the government about £8 billion a week.
Yeah, and that is unbelievable, really. If they're going to announce that it's going to be the furlong scheme is going to go for 4 months, and they haven't announced a sort of real exit strategy for this. And so I think that's where the frustration is, where's the exit strategy here? Because if it's going to go on for 4 months, we're talking total economic collapse, Well,
this is interesting. So you mentioned the alert system earlier, the whole 5 stages. The stage 5, I was actually talking to my dad about this. So he made a very good point, which is that stage 5 is that the NHS is not going to cope. We're not going to get to that because we've built these Nightingale hospitals and we've actually not had to use them. So we're never going to get to stage 5. So we're currently in stage 4, which is that the NHS is just about at capacity, but it's not doing all that great. Then, the other thing to consider is that it might be doing well in regards to coronavirus, but it is failing everywhere else. The other thing is that stage one, I think, as they pointed, level one, is that it's not present in the UK. Now, again, I'm not a virologist, so I don't know the science. But in terms of logic, that puts it on the same scale as things like smallpox, things that have been eradicated, because we haven't eradicated the flu, which this is. This is a flu. So if we're basing our our ideal scenario on a situation that can't happen, then it seems as though we are really confused as to what we actually want. So I completely agree that we don't have an exit strategy here, and we actually are being seen to have that more and more. There's no desire to have an exit strategy. Having the furlough scheme go on for an additional 4 months is just admitting that we don't know what's going on. So you really have to ask, if that's the case, are we doing the right thing? And I honestly don't know. And I think this is the real problem. But obviously, I'm an individual. I'm just a I'm just a political theorist. I don't know. We really should be expecting the government to have some knowledge on where to go here, and it just seems as though they really, really don't. That's what concerns me.
But what about the assault on, individual rights? Do you not see it as a liberty issue also?
Yeah, again, I mean, that's an interesting question. So a lot of people talk about this, and Peter especially has been particularly vocal in criticising the government for this. So I personally don't see an enormous issue, but that might be from my own experience. So I think it was the first week that all of this happened, I was driving through Birmingham. I'd gone to do, first of all, a bit of shopping because typical me, I had nothing in the house and the lockdown comes in. So I thought, right, well, I better go and get something. And while I was out, I thought, well, I'll take her for a walk. So the dog was in the back of my car, and there's a main road that runs from the centre of Birmingham to the university. And I was coming along that road, and all of a sudden it stopped. And the police had essentially shut the road down and filtering people through. And the bloke said to me when I got to the checkpoint, I suppose, he said, "What are you out for today?" And I said, "I'm just walking the dog." And he could probably see the shopping, so he probably knew I was being a bit of a, And he said, "Look," and he actually said, "I know it's shit, but once you've walked her, can you please go home?" And I said, "Yeah, absolutely." So I think it's on one of those perspective things because, objectively speaking, I don't really see this enormous erosion of civil liberties. I mean, I see an erosion of a certain civil culture. Not being able to go to the pub is an enormous shame. But I don't see it as being as a liberty issue because I see the individual basis of liberty, and if it's not really impacting the individual's life, a day-to-day base, then I don't really think it's corroding civil liberties. I think it might be corroding what you call communal liberties, but that's a different question. This is a crisis scenario, so those sorts of things have to be a different station. And I don't know if we're ready for that conversation yet, because I think we can clearly define what community rights are.
I think you would be correct personally if it was a more severe pandemic. For me, this is just not nearly severe enough. For me, you might as well. I know, people lambast people for making this comparison, but if you were to go by those that definition, I think you could do the same for the flu, and you could do the same for some other mild form of disease. I don't think corona is serious enough to warrant these measures, and so I do personally find it an attack on our liberty. But where you draw that line of when you're allowed to override, individual liberty and things like that, I don't know where that line exactly is. But for me, it's not corona.
No, that's a good question, and I think this is probably a sincere issue on the right. That this maybe reveals the fault lines of the right, in my opinion. There is the half of us that think that liberty is paramount, and then there's the half of us that think security is paramount. And most people in the former camp will quote Benjamin Franklin and his whole, if you surrender individual liberty to a bit of safety, you just either. But I'm also of the opinion that you need a certain degree. Well, you do. You need a certain degree of security in order to have liberty at all. So I agree with you in the sense that I know if necessarily Corona is that scenario, but we have to surrender some freedoms now in order to have freedoms later on. A friend of mine put it really well in his typical poetic way. I said, not having the pub for the summer is going to be the shame. And he said, well, I'd rather have Grand Christmas than have the pub for the summer. And I said, well, yeah, I mean, that's a fair point, actually. I do understand where you're coming from there. So
I think what I find most interesting, people who have argued in the case of liberty and freedom and things like this, I really find the American founding fathers to be almost not the ultimate intellectuals, because there were great people before them, but I think they really set the standard. And I think even they knew that really you want as much liberty as possible, but at the same time you still need to have the security. And I'm not sure, you have like laws in America where the president was able to force companies to make ventilators, and this was like a war law where you could force companies to manufacture for war. This probably wasn't brought in from the founding fathers, obviously, but I do think there is times where you do need an exchange between security and liberty, but on the whole, it should be leaning as much towards liberty as possible. That's what my feeling is on that matter. I'm guessing you would broadly agree.
Yeah, I mean, the thing I would, so the way I would kind of categorize it as a typical philosopher, that they are both means to an end. Neither of them are end themselves. Saying, okay, you've got security, great, but what do you do with that security? And it's the same with liberty. Someone says to you, you have liberty. Okay, liberty to do what? That's always the question. It's never an end in itself. So when we have, a trade-off here, we have to remember which one is going to produce the most or allow us to achieve the end that we want the most. So if liberty is going to give us what we want more than security, then by all means. But I think in this scenario, security is more likely to provide the ends that we desire than liberty. And that end is ideally being able to push this virus as far away from the majority of the population as possible, especially the aged, and also to recover the economy at the end of it.
This is what I don't actually like broadly about political ideologies, is that for the most part people get engulfed in political ideologies and it becomes more about the means and not so much about the ends. And that's why you get, I've recently watched a documentary on Netflix about Cuba and Fidel Castro, and despite all the people leaving his country, no matter what, he still was convinced that no, communism is the right way for sure. It doesn't matter what's actually happening in the real world. And what I like about conservatism is you can say it's an ideology, but it's sort of, I like Roger Scruton's definition of conservatism, where it's basically almost like an anti-ideology in a way, because it's the rejection of ideology. It's more affirming and conserving the things we already have. There's not like a set thing which we are conserving. It's just more, do you know what I mean? It's hard to put it into words.
It is hard. It is hard to put into words. And I don't.
And also, I didn't get you to answer the question earlier. What is a conservative? Because you did pose that question earlier.
Yes. Okay. So that question is extremely difficult because so when you said, particular things that we want to protect, or individual circumstances, there's always an example that I like to go to because it's a fantastic example. During the 19th century in Russia, there was this whole question of How should we modernize? And if we do, should we modernize like the West? And a lot of people were saying that the Russian model was so different to the West that this wasn't even a question. And the paradigmatic example of this was the Russian Commune. The Russian Commune was essentially, as described by a German sociologist, embryonic socialism. To that end, it had central village and land surrounding it that was redistributed every single year according to the number of able-bodied men in a household. Now, it's as close to communism as you can probably get in the real world, and for the most part, it worked. That's because it was an organic response to a real problem, not because it was an ideological creation. But when the revolutionaries in the 1860s and 70s went out to the people in, ironically enough, what was called the Populist Crusade, they were mostly rejected by the peasants, and actually a lot of peasants reported them to the gendarme or to the local police. And in that way, you can see this is a conservative attitude. It's not conservative as we would call it in the West, in any capacity, but it's conservative in an attitude. It's conservative in resisting ideology, in resisting this strange desire to surrender our organic freedom in favor of some artificial, promised freedom. And it was conservative in that it hated revolution. So that is a very conservative thing. And that is something that unites conservatives the world over. It's a preference for the real. And Roger Scruton described conservatism as he grew older to be the love of the real. That's what he called it. And that to me is as close as you can get to a definition, a positive definition, because to make a semantic point here, your point of saying it's an anti-ideology is what we call a negative definition. It defines itself by what it's not. But if we can define conservatism as something, then it has to be a love of the real. And what that means is that we have to look at what's around us and find value in it. And if we can't find value in it, then we have legitimate grounds to jettison it. But not necessarily in a revolutionary way, more in a sense of let's see if we can find meaning for it, because it must exist for a reason. It's the conservative attitude is very bound up with organicism and very bound up with the natural world. If something exists, there must be a reason for it. Now, in terms of like a definition of conservatism, my definition for the West, or for Britain in especially, is a preference for order, a preference for the institutions and authorities that have proven themselves to be stable over a long period of time, and a resistance to abstraction. And what that means essentially is a refusal to surrender, as I say, an organic and real life and what we would call liberties in favor of an abstracted, theorized, and promised liberty. And this, and to carry on, and I'm sorry this is not really a succinct definition, because it can't be. No. Liberties is different from liberty. Liberties are real and they've been discovered, and they are particular. They're suitable to a circumstance. Liberty is so abstract that you have to suffix it with something else. So it's the liberty to do something, or the liberty from something. Liberty is always concrete and they're always real. And as a result, they've grown up through a society that is prepared to try and test things. And this is something else that ideology does not do. It does not test. As you said with Cuba, it didn't try it, it forced it. And when it didn't work, it carried on. And it was the same in Soviet Russia, and it's been the same in communist China. If something doesn't work, it's not because the theory is false, it's because the practice did not go far enough. And what that essentially means is that communism, or ideology in general, can never admit to be wrong. So that's why conservatism, as you say, is an anti-ideology, because if it has positive contents, its positive contents come from the circumstance that it finds itself in, and from a resistance to an abstraction of those liberties.
An abstraction of the natural order, you could say, maybe.
Yeah.
I also really like the definition. I don't know where this comes from exactly, but I know that Douglas Murray quoted it from another conservative philosopher. Perhaps you can point me to who that person is. but it's a contract between the dead, the living, and those yet to be born, that the things that they have enjoyed in their lifetime will be passed down to the next generation. Absolutely. Maybe you could shed some light on who that was. Do you remember?
That's the paradigmatic Edmund Burke.
Edmund Burke. It is Edmund Burke. I was thinking if it was Edmund Burke, but I wasn't totally 100% sure.
Yeah, I mean, so I completely sympathize with this, and this is something that my thesis is actually exploring, which is the relationship of a people or a community to time. And when Burke was responding to thinkers and this idea of a contract, his concern was that people had misunderstood the idea of contract, because to him, contract had come down from the idea of covenant in the Christian religion, which is about a agreement, or an unbreakable agreement between an individual and the transcendental order. And Burke is famous for being extremely poetic, but therefore really difficult to nail down in terms of definition. So when he says the dead, the living, and the unborn, his goal is not to give us some great theory, but rather to speak in a really poetic way that speaks to real experience. So he's not trying to give us this elaborate definition of a contract, but he's pointing in the direction of the understanding of an individual in connection to something that exists beyond him. And if that beyond him is literally a connection between generations, then for Burke, that's enough. If it's more of a religious feeling of God or an aesthetic feeling of beauty, then that's also very conservative. What he hated and what he thought was a misunderstanding was this belief that contracts are signed by people outside of a circumstance, but also between themselves and some sort of government. He thought that you can't abstract people from a circumstance, as all good conservatives think, but also the contract is not just between you and government, because that makes you just an individual. It's between yourself and the people around you and the government that you as a people create over time. And that means there's no ideal government. It means there's no end to that government. And it also means that government cannot be created from scratch. So that's what essentially Edmund Burke is pointing at in a very brief definition. And it's typical Burke. He's very unsystematic, but he is so much better than any other writer could ever be when it came to a definition.
Right. Okay. Would you regard him as the penultimate conservative thinker throughout history? Oh, the person who nails down, conservative thinking more than anyone else, perhaps, because I know people often ask for reading lists of who they should read, and
Okay, so I think there are three. Burke is one of them. The reason I think Burke is one of them is because he expresses a feeling of culture and society better than anyone else ever has been able to. The other is Michael Oakeshott. The reason Michael Oakeshott is one of the best conservative philosophers of all time is because he talks about this idea of the danger of rationality, which is essentially a philosophical discussion on the very danger of ideology that we talked about. The third is Roger Scruton. And obviously Roger Scruton sadly was the best living philosopher and the best living conservative in the world. Now, the relation between the three is that Burke can give us an appreciation of society. Oakeshott can give us weapons against the left. So he tells us what game to play, but Scruton gives us a game plan. So the three of them have to be read together. And between the three of them, you can find a real, true appreciation of conservatism. So you can't just read one, you have to read all three.
What decade or century is Oakeshott from?
Oakeshott was writing in the 50s and 60s. His last written work was in the 70s, I believe.
I've never heard of him, to be perfectly honest.
This is a shame. A lot of people haven't. So there's this perception that conservatism basically died in the academy in the 20th century. And I mean, if it did die, it was killed. It didn't just disappear. But Oakeshott tried as hard as he could to carry on the conservative tradition, and there are lots of conservatives in academia, surprisingly. They're just, forced underground. But Oakeshott was mid 20th century, so you have to read him and Scruton together, in my opinion. Scruton's a very positive conservative. Oakeshott's a very negative conservative, and by that I don't mean pessimistic versus optimistic. I mean in terms of that distinction I made earlier between knowing what you're not, which is what Oakeshott does, and knowing what you are, which is what Scruton does.
If you had to name one book, two max, on the best book on conservatism, what would you name?
Scruton. It has to be Scruton. I want to say How to Be a Conservative.
I was thinking that one, yeah.
Because so he said to me once that he moved on from the meaning of conservatism, and that was written in the 80s, and it got him in a lot of trouble, that book. And he's moved on from it. He's not with us anymore. He moved on from it in his life. He said that How to Be a Conservative was the best book that he'd written on the topic. So yeah, it has to be that book. Right.
Okay, that's interesting. I want to fire off some quickfire questions from people that have commented in. Before I do that, I actually want to ask you one final question, which is basically, what do you think about... I don't want you to go too much into this because this can really get into a deep topic, and I don't want it to go there because I actually find it quite boring as well. But the Conservative Party, as it is not everything we would like it to be. I think that's obvious. But my personal opinion is it is the best vehicle for conservatism. Do you agree, or do you think that we need to move on from the Conservative Party and branch into somewhere else, or by other means, as some other people think?
So I'm gonna answer this in typical me fashion,
yeah.
Which is that there are two arguments for this, which I sympathise with both. And the first is Peter Hitchens, which is that if you go into a shop and you don't like anything on the shelves, you don't buy anything. Fair enough. Yeah. The other is that if you're at a train station and none of the trains that are going to that train station are going to get you to where you want to go, you don't walk away. You get the train that's going to get you the closest. So I sympathise with the latter, and I sympathise with your perspective, which is that the Conservative Party is the best possible vehicle for reintroducing or reasserting actual conservatism in Britain. So yes, I do agree. And, sorry for the long-winded answer.
Yeah. Well, no, that was relatively short, actually.
For me, yeah.
Yeah, for you. Okay. So let's have a look at what questions we've got here. I'll do the Facebook first.
Okay.
Sorry, I should have brought this up sooner.
No, that's quite okay. I didn't realise people were commenting as we talked.
Oh yeah. Okay, so I have a question here. When will Jake? Okay, no, I'm not going to ask that one.
I think I know which one that is. It's about aristocratic.
Yeah. Okay. So how about Corbyn's brother? Do you think Corbyn would have locked us down? I don't know if he's referring to Corbyn's brother or Corbyn there as far as the lockdown goes. I'm pretty sure Piers Corbyn would have done pretty much the same thing as far as the lockdown goes. As for his brother, I'm not so sure. What do you reckon?
Did you see the
protest he did against the lockdown?
Yeah. Yeah, that was typical Corbyn family, really. Yeah. The irony of all of this is that the Conservative Party has, in some ways, had to introduce some of the economics that the Labour Party wanted. But it did that in response to a crisis. Had the Labour Party been in power, it would have created that crisis itself. Now, no one could possibly have seen the coronavirus, unless you're China. But had Labour been in power, we would not been able to respond in the way we have, because we would have done what we've already done much earlier. So if what we're doing now is crippling the economy in response to a crisis, how would we have been able to respond to a crisis with a crippled economy? That's essentially why I'm quite glad Labour's not in power.
And someone commenting here, economic collapse is far worse than this current virus. I actually saw a tweet today. Apparently, there was a doctor in London who said there's a lot of suicides happening at the moment. I don't know if it's because of people out of work and things like that, but there is the question, when you get into, a long period of lockdown, this could become more of a problem. Absolutely.
Yeah, I feel very sorry for people who see no other option in life to take their own, in any circumstance. The possibility, this I'm not trying to say this is a way of legitimating this. I'm just pointing out a trend here. Economic collapse is usually accompanied by a rise in suicide, and it's horrible. And I can't say anything else really. It's a horrible thing, and I feel so sorry for people who feel that they're in that circumstance and have to take that choice.
I mean, they need to end the lockdown, really, ultimately, in my opinion. They can end the lockdown within a month, but I think when you start talking about anything past a month, it's just going to be too much. That's my personal opinion.
Yeah, and again, this kind of comes back to our question of what's the end that we're aiming at here, because it's all very well and good having 99% of the population alive, but what are they going to be left with? And that's and that's a horrible thing to have to say, because it's almost saying that you have to make a cost benefit analysis of lives versus economy, and if that is the choice that you have to make, you always go with lives. But how long is that sustainable for? That's ultimately the question facing the government. And I think you're right. I think another month of this is going to have to be the end of it, because so suicide, economic collapse is one thing, but loneliness is another, and domestic violence is another. There are loads of people that are stuck now with spouses that they don't want to be stuck with. It might be statistically negligible, but that's the problem with statistics. These are real people. They can't be summarized in statistics. And I feel so sorry for people who are stuck in these circumstances, stuck on their own when they don't want to be, stuck with people when they don't want to be with them. And after a while, how much is the human cost going to outweigh the potential economic cost? That's the real question we have to face. So I agree. Another month is probably the maximum.
I've got a question here asking, do you have a copy of the Communist Manifesto in your bookshelf?
Yes. Yes. I assume this is to do with the Michael Gove bookshelf scandal.
Oh, yes, of course. I totally forgot about that.
I make a point of reading the other side. There are probably more books on my bookshelf that are anti-conservative than there are pro, which is part of the reason that I'm a conservative, because I understand the other side. So yes, I have a copy of the Communist Manifesto.
Would you recommend it?
No, it's. For one thing, it's short, so you're going to get through it in about 20 minutes. For another thing, it's badly written. It's like Engels and Marx sat down and went, right, I want to put a poster up in London, and they banged out about 200 posters and went, now you know what? Let's turn this into a book. That's what it feels like. It just feels like sound bites. It's not really scientific. If you read Marx, you read Das Kapital, but if you really want to understand other stuff as well, you need to read the Paris manuscripts or the German ideology. And if you want to understand Engels, then you need to read the working class in England.
Yeah, I think I read it on a PDF actually when I read it.
It's bad.
We've got a question here from someone who's been on the show before, the English gent, as he calls himself. Do either of you believe we'll see a second spike regardless of when we come out of the lockdown?
Shall I answer first?
I do think we will see a second spike at some point for sure.
Oh, absolutely. This is the thing. The question is not whether we're going to have another spike. The question is how big we want it to be. That's essentially the problem here. If we, I mean, and again, don't know the science, but from what I can understand, and I think there is certain common sense that we need to refer to here, carrying the lockdown all the way through to autumn means that when we come out of lockdown, the spike is going to occur in winter, when people's immune systems are already lower than they would be optimally. If we come out of lockdown in the summer, then it's more likely to be naturally killed by virtue of the hot weather. So the answer to the question is yes, we are going to see a second spike. The counter question is how big do you want it to be? And the answer is obviously small. We want it to be as small as possible. And for that reason, it needs to be sooner rather than later.
What needs to be sooner? The end of the lockdown?
Yeah.
But naturally thinking about that, I didn't actually think about this, but perhaps Boris Johnson is being more strict on the lockdown because of in the winter it will be a lot worse. Perhaps maybe this is why he's thinking this way. Why do you think that ending the lockdown sooner would be better?
Because if we end it during the summer, then the natural warm weather will kill off more of the virus than the natural cold weather.
Oh, I see what you mean, yeah.
So if we come out of it sooner rather than later, we're likely to see a smaller spike. That's my, understanding.
Yeah, I think I remember seeing a study as well at some point which said something like the people who sort of do everyday contact, whether it be at the park and places like that, that is actually a very tiny percentage of the virus passing from person to person. It's actually more, being with relatives and things like that. So I think the lockdown is actually not saving a lot of lives, really. That's my personal belief, but I could be wrong. I actually was in favor originally of the herd immunity strategy, and I think I would have gone down the Sweden option if it was me. I think they probably had a better experience, but like I said, I'm not a scientist like yourself either, so
yeah, I comparing nations is always going to be risky because there are obviously different circumstances in every nation. The issue I see with, well, I was in favor of the herd immunity argument with a caveat, which is that there should have been a lockdown for at-risk groups. And a friend of mine is categorized as disabled, so he was told you have to stay inside now for 12 weeks, I think it was, and we're in week 7, I think it is now. So that's fine. But herd immunity for, say, people like us was possible. There are, I don't know the actual figures, but the number of deaths for under 35 with no underlying health problems is really low. If you look at the statistics, I think it was 80% of deaths are over 60s. So it almost feels like, we're just taking a very blunt, very unnuanced approach, and that as a result is really damaging us. That's my perspective on things with regards to herd immunity.
Yeah. Someone commented below that apparently Australia projected more suicides than COVID deaths. That's what they're saying. I don't know if that's true or not, but yeah, we'll have to see.
Yeah, unfortunately, we will.
I have no idea how Australia are dealing with it. with this. Actually, this is the first time I've ever heard of the lockdown in Australia. But
I didn't know they were
it
doing
is
one.
amazing how this thing has literally just taken the whole world. Though there's not really anywhere which hasn't been affected.
Yeah, this is which. I mean, yeah, it's quite astounding, really.
And it's
The
all
issue.
China's fault, correct?
Sorry.
And
Sorry?
it's all China's fault.
It's all China's fault. It's all China's fault. Yeah, yeah. The communist flu. I'm not going to call it the Chinese flu. I'm going to call it the communist flu. That's
Yeah.
my way of maintaining my free speech while skirting around the censor.
Yeah, I hope you don't have any people who funds your university from China. You might be in trouble.
Well, yeah, I should watch what I say, I suppose.
Yeah. Okay, well, we've gone for an hour and a half now. I think that was a pretty productive discussion.
Wow. I didn't realize. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you. I had a great time.
Yeah, definitely. I really feel like I had to listen a lot with your points as well, which I don't do for every guest.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
You know, really try to understand what they're saying.
I'm going to take that as a compliment.
Okay. Well, yeah, pleasure to speak to you. And I'm going to end the call now, but stay on the line.
Okay.